The most dangerous betrayals don't happen in hotel rooms. They happen on couches, right next to you. While you're relaxed, distracted, certain. She's smiling at her phone and you tell yourself it's nothing. That certainty is the weakness. Betrayal doesn't announce itself. It dissolves loyalty quietly through messages you'll never read and thoughts you were never invited into. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to state what most men refuse to face. Modern betrayal is invisible, emotional, digital. It leaves no lipstick, no receipts, no obvious lies. She doesn't leave the house. She leaves the relationship long before you notice. Her body stays, her attention doesn't. This story isn't about paranoia. It's about patterns, about how loyalty erodes in small deniable steps until the end feels sudden, even though it was inevitable. If you've ever trusted completely, this will sound familiar. If you haven't noticed anything yet, that's the point. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if this kind of clarity matters to you, consider subscribing. Calmly, intentionally. I used to believe betrayal had a sound, a slammed door, a late-night excuse that didn't add up, a sudden distance you could point to and name. I was wrong. Real betrayal is silent. It doesn't interrupt your life. It blends into it. It happens while dinner is still warm and routines stay intact. What most men don't understand is this betrayal doesn't begin with another body. It begins with another place for her attention to go. A place where you are not present. A place where she feels seen without accountability. She doesn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy the relationship. She steps away in inches. Each step small enough to defend. Each one deniable on its own. You think betrayal means leaving the house. Modern betrayal means staying. Staying physically while checking out emotionally. Staying loyal in form while abandoning loyalty in function. She doesn't lie about where she's been. She lies about where her mind goes when she's bored, lonely, frustrated, or restless. And you never think to ask because the old signs aren't there. Men look for evidence. We're trained to look for proof. But emotional betrayal doesn't produce the kind of evidence we recognize. There's no unfamiliar perfume, no missing hours, no sudden change in routine. She comes home. She sleeps next to you. She shows up, and that convinces you everything is fine. That assumption is the trap. The shift happens internally first. She starts sharing thoughts she used to bring to you with someone else. Not everything, just enough. A complaint here, a joke there. A moment of vulnerability that feels harmless because it's brief, because it's justified, because nothing physical happened. Each time she chooses another man as the audience for her inner life, something important moves out of reach. This is why betrayal feels sudden when it finally becomes obvious. You think it started when you caught it. In reality, it started when you stopped being the default place her thoughts returned to. When your presence became optional rather than central. When she learned she could feel understood elsewhere without consequences. Men fear the physical act because it's concrete. But the physical act is rarely the beginning. It's the ending. It's the last chapter of a book that's been written quietly for months or years. By the time bodies are involved, loyalty has already been gone for a long time. You're not losing her then. You lost her earlier when the rules changed without your knowledge. What makes this dangerous is how reasonable it all looks from the outside. She isn't sneaking. She isn't lying outright. She's just talking, just venting, just connecting. And if you notice the shift and say something, you sound insecure, controlling, old-fashioned. The culture backs her. The language protects her. You're left questioning your own instincts. I used to think loyalty was a clear boundary. Either you crossed it or you didn't. Now I see it as a slow erosion. 1,000 small choices where she picks comfort over commitment, validation over transparency, novelty over depth. None of them dramatic enough to justify confrontation. All of them significant enough to change the outcome. She doesn't feel like she's betraying you because she hasn't violated the old rules. She hasn't done the thing you're allowed to be angry about. That's the loophole. She stays technically loyal while emotionally elsewhere. And because the betrayal doesn't fit the outdated definition, it feels invisible even as it does real damage. This is why men get blindsided. We're watching the wrong door. We're guarding against a threat that announces itself. Meanwhile, the real shift happens behind a locked screen, inside conversations we're not meant to see, in emotional exchanges that feel innocent until they accumulate weight. By the time the weight is undeniable, the structure is already compromised. There's a moment most men miss. The moment she stops bringing her internal world home. When she starts editing what she tells you. Not because she's hiding something obvious, but because she's already processed it elsewhere. She's already been heard, already been validated. You become secondary, not rejected, just unnecessary. That's the part that hurts the most when you finally see it. Not that she found someone else, but that she didn't need you anymore in the way that matters. She didn't need your understanding, your attention, your presence in her emotional life. She learned she could get those needs met without risking the relationship. And that discovery changed everything. Men stay calm because things look normal. She stays calm because she's already adjusting. That's the imbalance. You're reacting to the present. She's been living in the future for a while. When she finally leaves, or finally crosses the line, you recognize you think it happened overnight. She knows it didn't. She's been preparing herself for a long time. This is not about villainizing. It's about recognizing a pattern that repeats because it's easy, socially defended, and emotionally rewarding. Betrayal has been redesigned. It no longer requires courage or conflict. It requires a phone, a little boredom, and the belief that feelings justify everything. Once you understand this, you stop asking the wrong questions. You stop asking where she's been and start asking where her attention lives. You stop measuring loyalty by proximity and start measuring it by priority. And you realize that by the time betrayal becomes visible, the relationship has already been over in ways that matter. That realization doesn't come with panic. It comes with clarity. And clarity changes how you see everything that follows. Loyalty was never defined the same way by both sides. I didn't understand that early enough. I assumed loyalty was simple. You don't sleep with other people. You don't cross obvious lines. You don't disappear. That definition made sense to me because it was concrete, measurable, enforceable. I didn't realize I was operating under a rulebook she never agreed to. For me, loyalty was physical exclusivity backed by honesty. For her, physical exclusivity was just the baseline, a starting point, not the standard. She didn't see sex as the line. She saw it as the last step. Everything before it existed in a gray area she felt entitled to explore. Emotional closeness, deep conversations, private jokes, shared frustrations. Those didn't register as betrayals in her mind. They registered as self-expression. This is where men get confused. We think loyalty is broken all at once. Women break it gradually and don't even call it breaking. They call it processing, venting, connecting, being understood. And because nothing physical has happened, they believe they're still loyal. Completely, honestly, without irony. She could share her fears with another man and still tell herself she was faithful. She could complain about me, describe our problems in detail, and feel justified because she wasn't touching anyone. In her internal accounting system, loyalty remained intact as long as bodies stayed apart. Everything else was negotiable. I didn't understand the concept of technical loyalty until I lived inside it. Technical loyalty means honoring the letter of the rule while violating its spirit. She was technically mine. She came home. She slept next to me. She showed up to events with me. But emotionally, she was diversified, spread across conversations, connections, and attention sources that didn't include me. She knew exactly where the line was, and she learned how to walk right up to it without crossing. That skill didn't come from ignorance. It came from repetition, from learning how far she could go before anyone objected, from discovering that as long as nothing physical happened, she could defend herself convincingly. And she did. If I ever questioned it, the response was immediate. Nothing happened. That sentence ended every discussion. It was airtight. How do you argue with nothing? How do you explain that something is wrong when there's no event to point to? That's the brilliance of emotional betrayal. It leaves you with instincts, but no evidence. Discomfort, but no accusation you can make without sounding unstable. She didn't think she was doing anything wrong. I believe that. Not because she was naive, but because the culture trained her to see emotional attention as harmless, even healthy. Men talk about their problems. Women share their feeling. That narrative protected her behavior. It gave her language to justify everything. What she didn't see or refused to see was the cumulative effect. Every time she chose another man as a confidant, she weakened our bond. Every time she felt understood elsewhere, she needed me less. Loyalty isn't just about what you avoid doing. It's about where you invest what matters. Time, attention, emotional energy. Those resources are finite. When they go somewhere else, they leave a vacuum. Men assume loyalty is binary, on or off. Women often experience it as fluid, conditional, dependent on how they feel in the moment. And feelings change. That's the problem. When loyalty depends on emotional satisfaction, it becomes unstable by design. There will always be moments of boredom, frustration, or dissatisfaction. In those moments, she doesn't recommit. She reallocates. She could justify emotional closeness with other men because it didn't threaten her self-image. She wasn't a cheater. She wasn't dishonest. She was just talking, just being herself, just maintaining friendships. That's how she saw it. Meanwhile, the relationship quietly lost exclusivity where it mattered most. I learned that loyalty from her perspective was emotional until it wasn't. Emotional boundaries existed only as long as they felt necessary. Once those boundaries felt restrictive, they became optional. And because nothing dramatic happened when they dissolved, she never felt the need to stop. This is where men underestimate the situation. We think if she hasn't slept with anyone, we're safe. But safety doesn't come from physical restraint alone. It comes from emotional alignment, from knowing that when something significant happens in her mind, you're the first place it goes. When that changes, the relationship is already compromised. She could fantasize about a different life and still say she was loyal. She could imagine herself understood by someone else and still feel committed. In her mind, thoughts didn't count. Feelings didn't count unless acted on. But thoughts shape feelings, and feelings shape actions. By the time actions appear, the internal decision has already been made. What hurt wasn't discovering that she had options. It was realizing she had been nurturing them while claiming exclusivity with me. She kept one foot planted and the other testing ground elsewhere. Not to leave immediately, but to make sure she could. That wasn't betrayal in her vocabulary. It was self-protection. Men don't think this way. We commit forward. When we choose someone, we narrow our focus. We don't keep backups because backups signal doubt. For her, backups signaled intelligence, preparedness, independence. She didn't see them as replacements. She saw them as insurance. And insurance changes behavior. When you know you have alternatives, you invest less in what you have. You tolerate less discomfort. You leave problems unresolved because you don't feel trapped. She wasn't trapped. She was buffered. And that buffer made loyalty feel less urgent. I started to see how differently we spoke about faithfulness. When I said loyal, I meant exclusive in body and mind. When she said loyal, she meant compliant with technical rules. We were using the same word to describe two different contracts, and she was honoring hers. That's the part men struggle to accept. She didn't feel like she betrayed anything. She followed her rules perfectly. The problem was that I never agreed to those rules, and neither did most men. We just assumed loyalty meant what it always meant. It doesn't anymore. Once you understand that a lot of confusion disappears, you stop expecting emotional exclusivity where none was promised. You stop being shocked by behavior that was always permissible in her framework. And you realize that modern loyalty isn't broken by force. It's diluted by design. By the time I understood this difference, it explained everything that came next. The defensiveness, the denial, the calmness when things were clearly shifting. She wasn't panicking because she didn't feel guilty. She felt justified. And justification is far more dangerous than deception. I didn't worry about her male friends at first. That was the point. They were introduced as harmless, safe, accounted for. She mentioned them casually the way someone mentions the weather. Just enough information to signal transparency, enough to make me feel included, enough to disarm suspicion before it could form. There was the guy from work, the one who understood her stress, the old friend from college who checked in once in a while, the neighbor going through a divorce who just needed someone to talk to. Each one came with a disclaimer. Just a friend, just work-related, just being supportive. And because she told me about them, I trusted her more. I thought transparency meant honesty. I didn't realize transparency can be camouflage. She never hid these men. She curated them. She controlled how much I knew. Not enough to alarm me. Not enough to reveal the real dynamic. I knew their names, not their roles. I knew their existence, not their function. That distinction mattered more than I understood. Here's what I missed. These friendships weren't random. They were strategic, even if she never framed them that way consciously. Every male friend represented potential, not immediate replacement, not an active plan, just possibility. A warm connection kept alive in the background. A door left unlocked, not open, just accessible. She wasn't auditioning replacements in the obvious sense. She was maintaining a roster of emotional safety nets. Men who made her feel interesting, heard, desired. Men who reminded her that she still had options, that her value wasn't confined to the relationship, that if things ever got bad, she wouldn't fall alone. She shared just enough of her problems with them to create intimacy, never the whole story, or just the parts that made her sympathetic, just the moments where she felt misunderstood. She laughed at their jokes a little longer than necessary, replied quickly enough to keep momentum. Let conversations drift from practical to personal without naming the shift. It all stayed deniable. This is what men don't want to admit. Most male friends are not neutral. They're patient. They listen without interrupting. They agree without challenging. They position themselves as the opposite of whatever she complains about. And she knows this. Not because she's calculating, but because attention has a tone. Interest has a weight. Women feel it. They always have. She knew when conversations crossed from friendly into suggestive territory. She knew when a compliment lingered too long. She knew when a message wasn't about the topic anymore. And she didn't shut it down. She moderated it. She adjusted just enough to keep the connection alive without forcing a confrontation with herself. She told herself she was just being kind, just being social, just being herself. But kindness has boundaries. Socializing has limits. What she was doing was different. She was feeding something, maintaining a low-level emotional charge that made her feel wanted without feeling guilty. I trusted her because she told me about these men. That was the trick. By mentioning them casually, she removed the sense of secrecy. But secrecy isn't about absence of information. It's about control of context. I knew they existed. I didn't know how often they talked, what time of day, what tone the conversations took when no one else was watching. She never told me when a work conversation turned personal. She never mentioned the late-night messages. She never described the emotional support she received when she was frustrated with me. Those details stayed private, not because she thought they were wrong, but because she didn't think I needed to know. That's when loyalty starts eroding. Not when something dramatic happens, but when information becomes selectively filtered. When she decides what you can handle. When she manages your perception instead of sharing reality. At that point, the relationship stops being a partnership. It becomes a performance. Every male friend was a test case. Not to see if she would cheat, but to see how much attention she could accept without consequences. How close she could get without triggering conflict. Each successful test reinforced the behavior. Nothing bad happened, so why stop? She wasn't replacing me. Not yet. She was hedging, keeping emotional liquidity, diversifying her sources of validation the same way someone diversifies investments. Not because they plan to abandon what they have, but because they don't want to feel exposed. And the men knew exactly what they were doing. They waited. They listened. They stored information. They learned her rhythms, her complaints, her unmet needs. They didn't rush because they didn't need to. Time was on their side. Relationships naturally produce friction. All they had to do was remain available when I wasn't. She told herself these men were friends because that label made everything safe. Friendship implied innocence. Friendship implied trust. Friendship implied boundaries without having to enforce them. But boundaries that are never enforced don't exist. They're suggestions. The moment she started talking about me to other men, the dynamic changed completely. Not to her, to the relationship. She shared frustrations that should have stayed between us. She described my flaws in ways that invited comparison. She handed over context that allowed other men to position themselves favorably without even trying. My boyfriend never listens. I feel invisible sometimes. We're going through a rough patch. Each sentence sounded harmless, honest, but every one of them was an invitation. An opening, a signal that space existed, that she was emotionally reachable, that competition was allowed. Those men weren't friends. They were candidates waiting for an opening. They didn't need to create problems. They just needed to wait for the ones that always arrive. And when they did, she already knew who would understand her. I trusted her friendships because I trusted her character. That was my mistake. Loyalty isn't protected by intention. It's protected by structure, by boundaries that don't depend on mood. She didn't have those boundaries because she didn't believe she needed them. She believed transparency made everything safe. But transparency without restraint is just exposure. It doesn't prevent betrayal. It disguises it. It creates the illusion of honesty while allowing emotional drift to continue unchecked. I didn't lose her to another man all at once. I lost her in pieces. In conversations I wasn't part of. In friendships that slowly replaced the functions I thought belonged to the relationship. By the time I noticed, those connections were already established. Warm, familiar, ready. That's the danger of backup plans. They don't feel like betrayal when they're being built. They feel like security, independence, smart planning. But when you need them, it's already too late to save what they quietly replaced. The betrayal never arrived all at once. It arrived in fragments, so small they felt unreasonable to question. A glance at her phone that lingered half a second too long. A smile that appeared and disappeared before I could ask about it. A reply typed with care when the message didn't require it. None of it mattered on its own. That's why it worked. These were not grand decisions. They were micro choices, repeated dozens of times a day. Each one a quiet preference for privacy over openness, for stimulation over stability, for secrecy over shared reality. She didn't wake up deciding to betray me. She simply chose what felt good in the moment again and again, without stopping to account for the cost. I noticed the phone first, not because she hid it, but because she adjusted it. A slight angle away from my line of sight. Not dramatic, just enough. Enough to keep something hers. Enough to maintain a boundary she'd never named. When I looked over, her expression shifted. The smile neutralized. The warmth cooled. She returned to me without explanation, as if nothing had happened. Those moments accumulate. Each one teaches her that separation is possible without consequence, that she can maintain a private world alongside the relationship, that she doesn't owe full access to her inner life. And once that lesson settles in, the relationship starts losing ground. She typed more than necessary. That was another sign. Simple messages don't require paragraphs. Logistics don't need emotion. But she gave it anyway. Tone, context, thoughtfulness, the kind of effort she used to bring to me. She redirected it subtly without announcing the shift. And because I couldn't point to a rule she broke, I stayed quiet. That silence was not strength. It was confusion. I felt something was off, but I couldn't articulate it without sounding paranoid. That's how emotional betrayal protects itself. It forces you to either ignore your instincts or accuse without proof. Most men choose silence. I did too. She began choosing when to share and when not to. Not in a calculated way, in a selective way. She'd tell me about her day, but not the part where she felt seen by someone else. She'd mention a conversation, but not the tone. She'd reference a name, but not the frequency. The truth was edited, not erased. And edited truth is the hardest to challenge. Every time she chose not to tell me something, a small distance formed. Not enough to feel like a rupture, enough to feel like space. Space she could step into when she needed relief from the weight of being known. Space that belonged to someone else. These micro-betrayals weren't about replacing me yet. They were about managing discomfort, about escaping boredom. about avoiding the friction that comes with long-term intimacy. Real relationships require confrontation, clarification, effort. These connections required none of that. They were easy, light, rewarding. She chose the thrill of being understood without responsibility, the comfort of attention without obligation. That choice didn't feel immoral to her. It felt practical, necessary. She told herself she deserved it, that she wasn't hurting anyone, that nothing real was happening. But something real was happening. Emotional energy was being diverted. Investment was being redistributed. The relationship wasn't being fed. It was being maintained at minimum levels while other connections received the surplus. I began to notice how quickly she responded to certain messages. Not instantly, strategically. Soon enough to show interest. Not so fast that it looked obvious. Timing is a language. She spoke it fluently. I didn't realize I was listening until it was already familiar. When I spoke, she sometimes drifted. Her attention flickered. She nodded, but her presence was thin. I could feel it. The words landed, but they didn't stay. She was already elsewhere, already anticipating the next interaction that made her feel more alive. That's the quiet cruelty of micro-betrayals. They don't announce themselves as choices against you. They present themselves as choices for her. Self-care, connection, expression. And because the language around them is positive, you hesitate to object. You don't want to be the man who limits her, controls her, questions her freedom. So you stay quiet. You adjust. You try harder. Meanwhile, she's learning that she doesn't need to bring her full self into the relationship to get her needs met. She can outsource parts of herself. She can fragment intimacy. She can keep you close while slowly making you irrelevant. Each micro-betrayal reinforces the next. Each secret makes the next one easier. Each boundary crossed makes the idea of boundaries feel outdated. She doesn't feel disloyal, she feels efficient. She's learned how to get more without risking what she has. I realized later that these moments happen constantly. 50 times a day. A glance, a reply, a deleted notification. A conversation paused when I entered the room. None of it dramatic, all of it directional. She was moving somewhere, not away yet, just towards something else. She began choosing her phone over presence, not overtly, casually, during conversations, during meals, during moments that should have mattered. The device became an extension of her attention, and her attention was no longer mine by default. I had to compete for it, quietly, without knowing the rules. That's when I understood the real betrayal wasn't another man. It was the repeated decision to prioritize a private emotional world over a shared one. To invest where she felt most validated rather than where she was most committed. Micro-betrayals don't break relationships immediately. They weaken them. They create a condition where larger betrayals feel justified later. When the foundation is already compromised, the collapse feels sudden. But it isn't. It's prepared for. She didn't think she was choosing them over me. She thought she was choosing herself. That's the lie modern language tells. That self-interest and loyalty can coexist indefinitely. They can't. Eventually, one displaces the other. By the time I felt the distance clearly, it was already normalized for her. This was just how things were now. She wasn't hiding. She was managing. She wasn't cheating. She was curating. And because there was no single moment to point to, the damage stayed invisible until it was irreversible. Micro-betrayals don't leave scars you can see. They leave absence. Absence of closeness. absence of priority, absence of truth. And by the time you realize what's missing, you're already standing alone in a relationship that still looks intact from the outside. If emotional betrayal needs a habitat, the workplace provides it. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, more waking time than she spends with you. That alone changes the balance, whether anyone admits it or not. Proximity creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort opens doors that were never meant to open. At work, she is seen at her best. Put together, focused, capable. Her voice is steady. Her energy is sharp. She's not exhausted yet, not drained by the weight of the day. That version of her belongs to everyone there. You get what's left. The tired version, the distracted one, the one who's already spent her emotional currency elsewhere. There is always one coworker, not all of them, just one. The one whose name comes up more than necessary. The one who somehow appears in every story, not as the subject, but as a constant presence. We were talking about a project. He said something funny today. He's having a rough time. The details are specific. Too specific for a professional relationship. She knows things about him she doesn't need to know. His divorce, his kids' schedules, his frustrations, his habits. And he knows things about her. Her stress, her doubts, her complaints. Her version of the relationship. Not the full truth. Just the parts that make her relatable, vulnerable, available. That's how intimacy forms without being named. Not through declarations, through repetition, through shared time, through being the person who understands her day without needing explanation. He doesn't have to catch up. He's already there, living the same hours, breathing the same air. Meanwhile, you hear about her day in summary. Highlights, complaints, edited moments. You weren't there when the joke landed. You weren't there when she felt appreciated. You weren't there when someone noticed her effort and said something about it. You receive the report, not the experience. This imbalance matters. Emotional bonds form where experiences are shared in real time, not after the fact. And she's sharing her real time with someone else, every day. Slowly, predictably, she tells herself it's unavoidable. Work is work. People connect. That's normal. And it is. Until boundaries dissolve. Until she starts sharing things she should bring home. Until the line between professional and personal blurs so gradually it feels artificial to enforce it again. She starts venting to him instead of to you. Not because she's hiding, but because it's easier. He's already there. He's already listening, already agreeing. He doesn't challenge her. He doesn't complicate things. He doesn't need anything from her except the chance to be present. She tells him about your arguments, about your distance, about your flaws, not maliciously, casually, as context. But context is power. She hands him a map of where the relationship hurts, and men know how to use that information. He positions himself as understanding, patient, different, not aggressively, subtly. He doesn't criticize you directly. He lets her do that. He just listens, nods, validates. He becomes the place where her frustrations land safely, and that safety builds attachment. At work, intimacy doesn't look like flirting. It looks like inside jokes, shared glances, private conversations that stop when others enter the room. It looks like lingering after meetings, like choosing the same lunch hour, like finding reasons to collaborate. She tells herself it's harmless because it stays within the building, because it happens in daylight, because it's tied to productivity. That's another illusion. Emotional boundaries don't care about lighting or job titles. They care about direction, and the direction is away from you. She invests energy into being understood at work, into being valued there. She wants to be seen as competent, interesting, essential. And when that validation arrives from a man who isn't you, it carries a particular weight. It's unburdened by history, uncomplicated by expectation. You don't get credit for what you've already given. He gets credit for what he hasn't. That's how novelty works. It always feels more rewarding than consistency. Over time, she begins comparing without realizing it. He listens differently. He responds faster. He seems more interested in her thoughts. She doesn't factor in the context, that he doesn't live with her, doesn't share responsibility, doesn't see her at her worst. Comparison without context always favors the outsider, and the workplace encourages this proximity. Teamwork, collaboration, open communication, all the language supports closeness. It discourages distance. Boundaries feel antisocial, cold, uncooperative. So she lets them soften. She brings her best self to work and her unresolved self home. That creates resentment she can't name. She feels more alive there, more appreciated, more engaged. And instead of questioning why, she accepts it as natural. Work is just more stimulating. You're just tired. The relationship is just in a phase. What she doesn't see is that she's feeding the imbalance. She's investing in the place that gives her the most immediate return. And attention follows investment. Always. She starts dressing a little differently on days she knows she'll see him. Nothing obvious, just intentional. She notices his reactions, not consciously, reflexively. Attention changes behavior. Validation shapes presentation. She doesn't think of this as betrayal. She thinks of it as confidence, self-expression, professional pride. The language protects her again. It always does. By the time you sense something is off, the connection is already normalized. It's part of her routine, part of her day. Questioning it feels intrusive. Why are you worried about a coworker? You sound insecure. You sound controlling. She's just working. That's the brilliance of workplace betrayal. It hides inside necessity. You can't object without sounding unreasonable, and she can defend it without lying. But make no mistake, emotional loyalty often dies there first. In offices, in shared tasks, in long hours, in the quiet understanding that develops when two people spend their best energy together day after day. You didn't lose her because you failed. You lost ground because the structure allowed it. Because no one teaches boundaries anymore. Because emotional intimacy is treated as casual. Because time spent together always produces connection, whether it's acknowledged or not. When she comes home tired and distant, it's not always because of work. It's because she already gave what you're asking for to someone else. Not physically, not dramatically, just enough to leave less for you. And once that pattern sets in, it rarely reverses on its own. It deepens, it waits. It prepares the ground for everything that comes next. Social media finished what proximity started. It took emotional drift and gave it scale, speed, endless reinforcement. What once required physical presence now required nothing more than a screen and a moment of boredom. Loyalty didn't collapse suddenly. It thinned out, spread across hundreds of interactions that felt insignificant on their own. Every photo she posted was a signal, not to her friends. They already knew her. It was a broadcast to men who didn't. Every story was a doorway, an invitation to react, respond, initiate. She knew this. She felt the attention before it arrived. Posting wasn't passive. It was anticipatory. She told herself she was just sharing her life. But she chose angles. Lighting, timing, She took multiple photos before selecting one. That selection wasn't about memory, it was about impact, about how she would be perceived. And perception matters when validation is the currency. The messages came quietly. DMs that started harmless, professional inquiries, casual compliments, old acquaintances checking in just to say hi. She didn't shut them down. She let them sit. She read them. She absorbed the attention. She told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong because she wasn't replying inappropriately. But attention doesn't require response to be consumed. Being seen is enough. Being wanted is enough. Each unread message was a reminder of optionality, of relevance, of value beyond the relationship. She kept those reminders close. Some conversations drifted. Slowly, a reply here, a reaction there. Enough to maintain a connection without committing to it. Enough to keep the door open. She wasn't building something specific. She was maintaining possibility. Social media made this effortless. It removed friction. There was no awkwardness, no accountability. Conversations could disappear. Messages could be deleted. Stories expired. Everything about the environment favored secrecy without requiring deception. She compared constantly, not intentionally, algorithmically. Every scroll presented curated lives, romantic gestures, vacations, men performing attentiveness. She consumed highlight reels and measured them against her reality, against you, against the ordinary weight of a shared life. Comparison is a quiet betrayal. It poisons contentment without announcing itself. She didn't think, I want someone else. She thought, why doesn't my life feel like this? But the dissatisfaction didn't have a clear target, so it attached itself to the closest one. You weren't competing against another man. You were competing against a composite fantasy. The best moments of hundreds of men filtered and optimized. A standard no one can meet. And she judged you by it, without telling you the rules had changed. She told herself social media was harmless because it wasn't physical, because it was just online. But emotional responses are real regardless of medium. Desire doesn't care whether it's fed digitally or in person. It grows where attention goes. She saved things to share later. Memes, jokes, videos, not with you, with them. That detail mattered. She curated connection. She built shared references, inside humor, a sense of continuity that lived outside the relationship. She checked reactions, not obsessively, habitually. A like from a stranger felt different than your praise. You were expected to appreciate her. They weren't. Their attention carried novelty, risk, reward. The validation addiction took hold quietly. One man's attention was nothing. 10 was flattering. 100 was intoxicating. She told herself it didn't change anything, but it did. It shifted the center of gravity. She stopped needing your affirmation as much. Not because she didn't value it, but because it wasn't scarce. She could get affirmation anytime, anywhere, and abundance cheapens what once mattered. Social media also made boundaries ambiguous. What counts as flirting, what counts as harmless. The rules are unclear by design. Gray areas protect behavior that would once have been obvious. A heart emoji, a fire reaction, a late-night reply, all defensible, all directional. She followed men who didn't belong in her life, not because she planned to act, but because she enjoyed watching, fantasizing, comparing. She fed a private world of desire that never included you. Her body stayed loyal, her imagination didn't. She watched stories from men she would never meet, imagined interactions that never happened. Those fantasies shaped expectations, made reality feel dull. That dullness wasn't your failure. It was the cost of overstimulation. Social media also made exit feel easy. She could picture a life without you because she saw fragments of it daily. Independence, freedom, attention. She didn't have to imagine the unknown. It was curated for her. She began hiding in plain sight, scrolling while sitting next to you, reacting to someone else while nodding at you. Her attention split, then shifted. Presence became partial. You tried to talk. She listened with half her mind. Notifications interrupted moments that should have mattered. The possibility of something interesting happening elsewhere outweighed what was happening in front of her. That's not an accident. Platforms are designed to hijack attention, and attention is the foundation of loyalty. When attention is fragmented, loyalty follows. She told herself it was normal. Everyone does it. That's true. That's why it's dangerous. Betrayal normalized doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like participation. She didn't see herself as disloyal. She saw herself as connected, expressive, modern. She wasn't hiding because hiding implies guilt. She felt none. But loyalty requires restraint, and restraint has no reward in an economy built on engagement. Every system around her encouraged more exposure, more attention, more validation. None of it encouraged preservation. By the time you noticed the distance, social media had already reshaped her internal world. She wasn't comparing you to one man. She was comparing you to the endless possibility of better. And no real person can compete with endless possibility. She was never alone in her justifications. That was another mistake I made, assuming these choices happened in isolation. They didn't. They were reinforced, validated, normalized. Loyalty rarely collapses in private. It dissolves in groups. Her friends were not neutral. They didn't ask hard questions. They didn't challenge her drift. They didn't defend the relationship when she stopped doing it herself. They protected her feelings first, always. And in doing so, they protected the behavior. Girls' nights weren't just about relaxation. They were calibration sessions. Stories were exchanged, experiences compared, lines redefined. What once felt questionable became ordinary through repetition. When one woman crossed a boundary and suffered no visible consequences, it raised the acceptable limit for everyone else. She talked about me there. Not with malice, with narrative. Every conflict became a story of my shortcomings. Every disagreement proof that she was carrying more than she should. Context disappeared. Her role softened. The audience nodded. Empathy flowed in one direction. Misery loves company, but more than that, it loves justification. A friend in a struggling relationship doesn't want to be alone in that struggle. She wants confirmation that it's normal, that she deserves better, that her dissatisfaction is valid. And that confirmation rarely comes with accountability. Some of her friends were single, some divorced, some perpetually unhappy. Their advice came from their position, not her situation. Freedom was praised. Options were celebrated. Commitment was framed as limitation. Loyalty is something you earn, not something you uphold. They didn't say protect what you have. They said you deserve to feel fulfilled. Those two ideas are not the same. Fulfillment became the standard. Anything that didn't serve it became negotiable. They helped her craft responses, not to cheat, to maintain interest, to keep doors open without crossing obvious lines. There's an art to plausible deniability, and it's taught socially. A delayed reply here, a neutral emoji there, enough warmth to keep attention, enough distance to deny intent. They analyzed messages together, interpreted tone, suggested wording, laughed about temptation. normalized it. What was once private now had an audience, and when an audience applauds, behavior escalates. They covered for each other automatically. That's not conspiracy, it's culture. If one needed an alibi, it was provided without question. If one felt guilty, the guilt was reframed as repression. Sisterhood meant protection, even when protection came at the expense of truth. I sat across from these women at dinners, smiled, listened, trusted. They knew more about my relationship than I did. They knew her doubts, her frustrations, her contingency plans. And they said nothing. Loyalty to the group outweighed loyalty to honesty. When she crossed into emotional affairs, the language softened. It's just someone who listens. Nothing physical happened. You're allowed to have friends. If guilt appeared, it was redirected toward me. If something feels wrong, maybe the relationship is wrong. That logic is seductive. When I noticed the shift and raised concerns, she didn't meet me alone. She came armed with talking points, language polished by consensus. I wasn't responding to her anymore. I was responding to a committee. You're insecure, you're controlling, you're overthinking. These phrases didn't originate in our relationship. They were imported, weaponized, repeated until I questioned my own perception. That's the power of collective validation. It drowns out instinct. The emotional affair became her preferred form of escape because it was defensible. If confronted, she had backup, witnesses, allies, a story where she was reasonable and I was unreasonable, where her actions were self-care and my objections were fear. Her friends never asked if it was fair to me. Fairness wasn't the metric, feeling was, and feelings justified everything. They shared dating app profiles just for fun, not because they planned to use them, but because curiosity was normalized. Swiping became entertainment. Validation without commitment. It felt harmless because it was framed as play. They compared options, discussed men, weighed qualities. All while relationships remained technically intact. This wasn't cheating in their minds. It was awareness, market research, preparation. Every conversation shifted the boundaries slightly. What was once betrayal became possibility. What was once wrong became understandable. And once something is understandable, it's forgivable. Once forgivable, it's repeatable. The group dynamic mattered more than any single friend. Together, they created a feedback loop. Discontent echoed, justifications multiplied, accountability vanished. She didn't feel alone in her choices. She felt supported. When guilt surfaced, it didn't last. Someone reminded her of her worth. Someone else shared a worse story. Perspective shifted. The relationship lost urgency. Her feelings took center stage. She didn't see herself as disloyal. She saw herself as evolving, growing, finding herself. Those words carry moral weight now. They shield behavior from scrutiny. If something feels good and aligns with identity, it must be right. And when I noticed the distance and tried to address it, I was alone. She wasn't. That imbalance mattered. She had reinforcement. I had intuition. Emotional betrayal thrives in environments where no one says no, where questioning behavior is framed as judgment, where boundaries are treated as insecurity. Her friends didn't push her toward me. They pushed her toward comfort. Comfort isn't commitment. It doesn't build. It doesn't preserve. It avoids. And avoidance feels good until it costs you everything. By the time she stood firmly in her choices, she didn't feel like she was betraying me. She felt like she was being true to herself. That narrative didn't come from within. It was constructed around her, fed to her, repeated until it felt real. I learned then that betrayal isn't just personal. It's social. It's taught. It's normalized. And once a group agrees that loyalty is optional, an individual rarely resists. The moment secrecy enters a relationship, loyalty is already dead. Not wounded, not weakened, dead. I didn't understand that at first because I thought secrecy had to be dramatic. A hidden phone, a fake account, a clear lie. I was wrong. Secrecy begins much earlier in places that feel harmless until they aren't. It started when she began editing herself. Not for me. For others. She chose which version of her thoughts went where. The honest version went elsewhere. I got the softened one, the safe one, the version designed to avoid friction. That wasn't kindness. It was separation. Every secret requires energy to maintain. You have to remember what you said and to whom. You have to monitor reactions. You have to protect the boundary you never admit exists. That energy comes from somewhere. It comes from the relationship. Each secret is a brick. Stack enough of them and a wall forms. You don't notice it being built. You notice it when you can't reach each other anymore. Technology made this effortless. She didn't need to leave the room to leave the relationship. She could build entire emotional connections during a lunch break, during a commute, sitting right next to me. Conversations that disappeared, messages that left no trace, intimacy that existed without evidence. The same phone I thought kept us connected gave her an exit from presence. The same apps meant for communication became tools for fragmentation. She could be everywhere, except with me, all while appearing attentive. That's the danger of modern betrayal. Doesn't disrupt routines, it bypasses them. She created small private systems, nothing alarming on its own. A deleted thread, a separate folder, a conversation muted instead of ended. These weren't red flags in isolation. They were infrastructure. A private world that didn't include me and didn't feel wrong to her because it felt controlled. She told herself privacy was healthy. Everyone needs space, and that's true. But privacy has a purpose. It protects individuality, not alternative intimacy. When privacy starts shielding emotional investment elsewhere, it stops being healthy. It becomes a hiding place. I noticed she dressed differently on certain days. Not dramatically, intentionally. Days she knew she'd be seen, days she expected attention. She thought about how she would be perceived, by whom. That thought process mattered more than the outfit itself. She was performing, not for me, for an audience I wasn't part of. She saved things to share later, not with me, with them. Funny observations, personal thoughts, small moments. That's how intimacy builds. Through shared reference, through continuity. She was building a parallel narrative, one that ran alongside the relationship, but never intersected with it. The validation she received there didn't feel dangerous because it didn't demand action. No confrontation, no decision, just reinforcement. And reinforcement changes behavior more effectively than pressure ever could. She didn't betray me for one man. She betrayed me for potential, for the feeling of being desired by many, for the comfort of knowing she had options. The attention economy taught her that value is measured by response. Likes, messages, interest. And that economy never sleeps. One compliment from a stranger hit harder than 1,000 from me. Not because mine didn't matter, but because it was expected. Obligation dulls impact. Novelty sharpens it. She didn't question that difference. She enjoyed it. The hypocrisy surfaced quietly. She demanded transparency from me while maintaining her own secrecy. She checked my phone while guarding hers. She wanted reassurance while collecting backup plans. She wanted exclusivity while resisting restriction. In her mind, this wasn't hypocrisy. It was self-protection. She wasn't planning to leave. She was making sure she could. That distinction mattered to her. Pre-betrayal felt reasonable, smart, responsible. She wasn't doing anything wrong yet. She was just prepared. That preparation changed everything. When you know you have an exit, you invest less in fixing what you're in. You tolerate less discomfort. You stop fighting for understanding. You stop risking vulnerability. Why risk when you can retreat? I noticed it when she stopped arguing. Not because things were good, but because she didn't care enough to engage. Anger requires investment. Silence requires detachment. She saved her emotional energy for connections that rewarded her immediately. I became background noise. She began separating her identity from the relationship. Plans became I instead of we. She stopped posting us, stopped referencing us, not as a statement. As a transition, she was practicing being single while still partnered, rehearsing independence without paying the cost yet. She rewrote history quietly. Past conflicts became evidence. Past mistakes became patterns. Past efforts disappeared. This narrative justified the present. If the relationship was always flawed, then emotional distance made sense. Betrayal became correction rather than violation. Her friends reinforced this version. Her online world echoed it. Culture applauded it. Loyalty started to look outdated. Commitment looked limiting. She wasn't abandoning anything valuable. She was outgrowing it. She genuinely believed she was a good partner. That's the hardest part to accept. She came home. She didn't cheat physically. She showed up when required. In her accounting, that was loyalty. The emotional energy she spent elsewhere didn't register as theft. It felt infinite. It wasn't. The fantasy betrayal ran alongside everything else. She imagined versions of men who didn't exist, idealized coworkers, fictional characters, curated personas online. She compared you to fantasies and found you lacking. Reality always loses to imagination when imagination is fed constantly. Work trips and girls' trips gave her distance without guilt, space to be seen as an individual, not half of a couple. She enjoyed that freedom. The possibility mattered more than action. The idea that she could be chosen again, that she wasn't settled, that she was still desired. The attention economy rewarded her for this. Every platform, every interaction, every validation reinforced the belief that loyalty was negotiable, optional, conditional, and conditions change. By the time I understood what was happening, the wall was already built. Not high, solid. There was no dramatic betrayal to confront, just absence. A sense that I no longer mattered in the places that counted. She didn't feel like she had done anything wrong, and that's what made it irreversible. You can't repair what someone doesn't see as broken. You can't negotiate boundaries with someone who believes boundaries are oppression. Modern betrayal doesn't look like leaving. It looks like preparing to leave. Quietly, efficiently, without guilt. And by the time the departure becomes visible, the relationship has already been abandoned in every way that matters. What I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it matters. The most dangerous moments in life don't arrive when things are clearly falling apart. They arrive when everything looks normal and no one is paying attention to the quiet shifts underneath. Loyalty doesn't usually break from one dramatic decision. It erodes when boundaries go unspoken, when attention drifts unchecked, when comfort replaces responsibility. And by the time the damage is visible, it often feels sudden only because you weren't taught where to look. The lesson isn't to live suspicious or hardened. It's to understand that trust without awareness is not virtue. It's exposure. Healthy relationships don't survive on assumptions. They survive on shared priorities, clear boundaries, and the discipline to protect what matters, even when temptation is convenient and consequences feel distant. Attention is not infinite. Emotional energy is not free. Where you spend them determines what grows and what withers. This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about recognizing patterns early enough to respond with clarity instead of shock. You can't control another person's capacity for betrayal. You can only control how much of yourself you leave unprotected. Self-respect begins where blind faith ends. If this reflection resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. Tell me what stood out or what your experience has taught you. And if you value calm, honest conversations like this, without noise, without exaggeration, consider subscribing to the channel. Not out of pressure, out of alignment. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones that feel good. They're the ones that keep you awake just long enough to change how you live.